But now we're talking about perhaps in a year, what, maybe 50 weeks or something. 50 weeks from now, we might be changing the Constitution, or we might not. And it's going to have a lot of impact on all of us here, on all the folks we know and love, and on all the folks who are going to be sitting here in these chairs 5 years, 10 years, and indeed 50 years from now. And hopefully by then we will have gotten it right. I don't know. I hope so. That's why I want you to stand up and really welcome Ralph Martire for the pro side and Dan Proft for con. Come on up, guys. All right, Oxford style. Pro goes first. That's you, Ralph. I know we kept that from you until just now.
Yeah. Well.
So Ralph's going to chat for 10 or so minutes and give his thesis. Dan will give his thesis contra. They're then going to rebut each other for a few minutes. And then after that, all of you join in the conversation with your questions. So I'm looking for better questions then than participation we had just now. Okay? All right, great. Your Honor, the floor is yours. You may use the podium if you wish.
Right, so.
Give him a big round of applause. Come on.
When you're representing the pro-tax size, you want a podium so there's blockage of things people could throw at you. It's always a good thing. So I am Ralph Martire. I'm Executive Director of the Bipartisan Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. That's right, my group is bipartisan, so my board of directors does have Democrats and Republicans on it that don't like or trust each other at all. And that's actually good for us at the staff level because we try to focus on best practices and data. And when you're talking about tax policy, the last thing that usually becomes part of the conversation is best practices and data. It gets to be a very ideological discussion that's really not focused on the facts or how you design a good tax system. So we live in a state, Illinois, that has never had good tax policy if you just picked up a tax textbook. There's a couple of things your tax system are supposed to do in order to sustainably fund services over time. They're supposed to respond to the economy. That's one of the economic principles. They're supposed to be stable during poor economic times. And they're supposed to treat taxpayers fairly in two different ways. Horizontally, two taxpayers have the same income, should have the same tax burden. And vertically, and there's where all the contention comes in, how do you treat taxpayers with very different incomes fairly? The answer to that last part has always been progressive taxation. That is, higher tax burdens on upper income folks than on lower and moderate income folks. I want you to know how venerable of a principle that is. It goes all the way back to a guy named Adam Smith. You ever hear Adam Smith? He invented capitalism and the Wealth of Nations. Bonus question for the class. What year was it published?
1776.
1776. America and capitalism born together, meant to be. It's the right thing. So, in the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, and this is a quote, said taxes ought to be designed to, quote unquote, remedy inequality of riches as much as possible by relieving the poor and burdening the rich. Why? He felt that if you had a capitalist economy, economic growth would always disproportionately advantage top income classes over bottom and middle income classes due to bargaining power. That is, he felt the owners of capital had so much bargaining power over mere laborers that they would always, in the bargaining process, take some of the value of the input created for the economy by laborers and put it in their own pocket. Not evil or immoral, but how the system was going to work. So if that's how the system was going to work, folks at the top of the income ladder ought to have the greatest tax burden as a percentage of income to support the government that in turn supports this great economy that gives them a disproportionate advantage. The great thing about Adam Smith's theory here is it's testable with data. So what do the data show? Well, from the end of World War II through 1979 in America overall, The wealthiest 10% after inflation got about 35% of all the growth in income, and the bottom 90% got about 65%. However, from 1979 forward, the skew to the top worsened significantly. And in fact, since that time period, the wealthiest 10% after inflation have realized 108% of all growth in income in America. So if you don't like math too much, I will point out 100% would have been all of it. So if more than all the growth in income went to the top, that means the bottom 90% at the end of the sequence was actually earning less after inflation than they had in 1979. Illinois' data tracks the national data exactly. We've had the same differential in income growth in our state. If you break it down even more and you look at the wealthiest 1% in our state since 1979, their incomes after inflation have grown by 177%. For the bottom 99%, so this is including the rest of the folks in the top 10 who saw growth, overall 9%. So if I had a graph to show you this, you'd see the top 1% with incomes growing like this over time, after inflation in real terms, and the bottom 99% virtually flat, actually negative for the bottom 90. There is only one tax in the entire toolkit that can respond to this, and that's the income tax. Every other tax and fee available to state or local government is regressive in incidence. That is, it has to take a greater portion of the income of a low or moderate earning family than of a more affluent family. So from a tax policy standpoint, you pick up a textbook. It will tell you the role of your income tax is twofold in your system. It's to respond to where the economy is growing and to assess tax burden fairly among people with very different incomes. But the only way it can do that is with a graduated rate structure. Now, in a perfect world, we would just put in a graduated rate structure in Illinois that was rationally designed and go on, but of course, you and I don't live in a perfect world. We do, in fact, live in Illinois. So, yeah, it's usually a problem on so many levels. So Illinois has a state constitution that literally requires a flat tax. So we're constitutionally prohibited from actually utilizing the one tool in the tax policy toolkit that can actually be designed to comport with ability to pay by assessing higher rates at higher levels of income and lower rates at lower levels of income. So fundamentally, if we want our tax policy to work in a modern economy, we need this tool in the kit. Number two, Illinois needs to raise more revenue. I don't know if you know this, we've had fiscal problems in our great state. And in fact, what the data show is if you assume we start with a balanced budget today, we're not, by the way. We have an accumulated deficit of $7.7 billion, okay? But if we were starting with a balanced budget, and you just adjusted for inflation and changes in population, you assume a normal economy, and you assume no changes in law, the cost of continuing to provide current level of services and paying our current debt grows like that, but our revenues grow like that. It's baked in to our fiscal policy, our tax policy, because it's flawed. Now, what about overspending? Is that really the driver of this issue? Let me think about it. No. So, if you look at the data, I'm going to give you the data, there's no argument anyone can possibly make that's data-based that spending on services is driving the deficit problem at the state level. For instance, 97 cents out of every dollar the state spends on services, 97 cents out of every dollar go to four things: education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. 3% goes to other. So other would include what? It includes economic development, it includes environmental protection, it includes the parks, it includes central management services, everything else state government does. In the 2020 budget, we are scheduled to spend $21.1 billion, $27.1 billion on these services, 27.1. In 2009, at the end of the Great Recession, we were spending 27.5, 400 million more in nominal dollars, not even adjusting for inflation. You want to adjust for inflation? We are spending less on all these core services today, 11% less in real inflation-adjusted terms than the state did in the year 2000 under Governor Ryan. Spending on services isn't the problem. We've had a tax policy that doesn't respond to where economic growth is happening in the modern economy because our income tax can't assess higher rates on higher levels of income, and hence it's missing where all the growth in the economy is occurring. When you have a very regressive tax structure, and because of our flaw with the income tax, Illinois, in fact, has a very regressive tax structure, imposing a significantly greater tax burden on low and moderate income families than on affluent families. What you're doing, just from a tax policy standpoint, is you're focusing your revenue collection on folks whose incomes are declining after time when you adjust for inflation. That doesn't work if you believe in an ideology called math. You have to raise revenue from where the economy is growing, not where it is declining, or you cannot maintain your expenditures on services. So where are we in Illinois? We have the 6th largest population and 5th largest economy of any state, but we rank at or near the bottom in America in funding, education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. So since spending on services hasn't driven our problem, but tax policy has, and one of the key things you need to do to get your tax system to work is have a graduated rate structure, this is a crucial moment in time. It will allow us to send a message to Springfield that, in fact, we want good policy to govern difficult political issues like how we tax our society, rather than ideological worldview. Okay? It's a strong message. It's a needed message. Now, is it the only thing we need to do to fix our state's fiscal problems? No. No. We designed our sales tax the wrong way. We, for years, because of this structural deficit I talked about, where revenue growth wasn't quite enough every single year to maintain the same level of services after inflation and changes in population, because of that, lawmakers in both parties, as a bipartisan thing, decided, gee, let's not raise taxes, because tax, it's really one of 2 3-letter words ending in X in the English language that gets everyone all excited. Let's stay away from tax policy. And let's just, I don't know, find some long-term obligation we could underfund and write an IOU to, and then take the money that should have gone to this item and hide our structural deficit with it, spend it on services. What do you think they picked? The pensions. So our poor tax policy is the primary reason we have a huge unfunded pension liability. And if you look at the state's own numbers, by far and away, the largest factor in that growth in the unfunded pension liability is, in fact, the really aggressive borrowing against what we owed these systems in normal cost contributions for decades. By far and away, the biggest piece. It's a problem. Another problem when you have bad tax policy and a structural deficit is the state will look to, I don't know, shift down to the local level costs the state should be paying. What do you think the state decided to shift to the local level? Any guesses? K-12 funding. That's why Illinois ranks first in the nation in property tax use to fund public schools, and 50th in the nation in the portion of public school funding that actually comes from the state. That's why your property taxes are too high. And yes, your property taxes are too high. But it's because state fiscal policy is fundamentally flawed, and it's fundamentally flawed because our income tax can't be designed to respond to how income is distributed over time, to respond to ability to pay, and to treat taxpayers fairly. So it's a crucial step forward in solving our fiscal problems. Thank you.
Let's hear it. Let's hear it. Thank you, Ralph. And now, Dan Proft. Give him a round of applause. Come on. Thank you. Hey, wait. That's mine. Yeah.
Thank you. In a recent letter to the editor in the Chicago Tribune, a benefits consulting professional described how a 58-year-old friend of his had come to him for help in purchasing her health insurance. She makes $60,000 a year as a consultant. She couldn't afford the Blue Cross plan, and she was afraid to take the short-term United Healthcare plan because of its 60-day coverage gap and its pre-existing conditions clause. So what did she do? She moved to Florida. Fortunately for her, she had inherited a condo from family. Once in Tampa, she was able to get a long-term policy with no coverage gap and no pre-existing conditions for $6,500 less than what she would have paid in Illinois. In addition to that, she saved $3,000 a year by not having to pay a state income tax in Florida. So that represented a 16% annual increase in her take-home pay, plus a better health care plan, just by moving to Florida. Her story is representative of the Hobson's choice Illinois is presenting to its residents. Can you not afford to leave, or can you not afford to stay? There is no bigger indictment of Illinois' political class than the fact that families who don't want to leave are nonetheless fleeing this state like it's on fire. A full half of families want to leave, and they are methodically pursuing their various exit strategies. The number one reason they cite? Taxes. They simply can't make it make financial sense to be here anymore. The response from the political class, as per the topic of our debate today, is a structural income tax increase to build on the 32% income tax increase that was imposed just 2 years ago. The big government elites in Illinois just can't get productive people out of here fast enough. Why? Because political power, not economic vitality, is their endgame. And if you don't understand this, then we can debate the statistics all day long. You're going to miss the forest for the twigs. The bitter irony here is that the more people who leave, the better it gets for the recreational Marxists in power. Those staying are mainly your lakefront and North Shore Champaign socialists, the nuclear freeze Friends of Ralph out Oak Parkway, the Maduroistas who run the public sector unions like CTU, and the beneficiaries of transfer payments dependent on the state. Going are middle-aged, middle-income folks and upwardly mobile young families, and left are those insulated from the terrible public policies they've helped to memorialize into law. To wit, according to IRS data, between the years 2011 and 2015, Illinois lost more than $14 billion in adjusted gross income. During those same years, those leaving Illinois had household incomes on average $20,000 greater than those coming into Illinois, the largest spread of any state in the nation. You're going to hear, as you have from Mr. Martire, that in fact Illinois is a relatively low-tax state. Our tax policy is wrong. It's too low. And that regardless, this latest fleecing of Illinois families hits only the top 3%, fairness argument you heard, while providing relief for the bottom 97%. You're going to hear from Mr. Martire, in fact, that state tax policy has no effect on job creation. Yeah. In an op-ed in the State Journal Register in April of this year, Mr. Martire argued that there is, quote, no statistically meaningful relationship between state tax policy on the one hand and job growth or entrepreneurial activity on the other. That probably comes as a surprise to many of you entrepreneurs. First, Illinois has the highest property tax burden and highest combined state and local tax burden in the country right now, before this graduated state income tax. And that's not including the taxes everyone will be paying on the dope they smoke to make Illinois tolerable. To the extent there is some variance in the rankings on these topics, Illinois is in the top 5, even in the studies that are the most generous to it. Second, It is true that the proposal on the November 2020 ballot would increase the state income tax rates only on those making more than $250,000 initially. Those making between $100,000 and $250,000 would see the rate stay the same. Those making between $10,000 and $100,000 would see a reduction in the rate by 0.05%. That's hardly the serious relief for the bottom of 97% that's being advertised. But that's not the real canard here. The big lie here is that we are told to consider this proposal with no context. We are not to consider what our political rulers will do once they've broken the seal by amending the Constitution and allowing them to reconfigure, and reconfigure is a synonym for raise in this context, reconfigure rates down the road. To that point, we're not to consider how little the $3.5 billion that the tax hike would raise, according to its proponents, against 2 times that in unpaid state bills right now. $10 billion worth of new spending proposals from Governor Pritzker, and of course at least $200 billion in unfunded public sector pension and health benefits. Jesus Christ himself would have trouble multiplying $3.5 billion to cover all of those obligations. But our neighboring states have higher income tax rates than those proposed in Illinois, they say. That's also true. Wisconsin imposes a 6.27% income tax on incomes between $22,900 and $252,000, and a 7.65% rate on incomes over $252,000. But Wisconsin also has a fully funded public sector pension system, while its 5 public sector pension systems in Illinois are a combined 40% funded at present. Additionally, Wisconsin residents still have a lower state and local tax burden than Illinois. Wisconsin is not a particularly low-tax state, yet according to a Badger Institute study, 116,000 Illinoisans relocated to Wisconsin between 2006 and 2017. So there must be something going on. Iowa graduates its income tax rates even faster, with those making between $49,000 and $73,000, round numbers, paying 7.44%, and those above $73,000 paying 8.53%. But Iowa also enjoys the best K-12 test scores in the country. And as with Wisconsin, Iowa residents still have lower state and local tax burdens than Illinois. Additionally, Wisconsin and Iowa, along with every other Midwestern state, are adding population while Illinois hemorrhages it. As one of those truisms in life goes, if you're not growing, you're dying. So what is Illinois doing? The point again is that context matters. The other point these comparative rates in Wisconsin and Iowa tell us is the tax hikers will come for middle-income families. Just ask the residents of Connecticut, the only state to enact a graduated state income tax in the last 3 decades. Connecticut routinely competes with Illinois for the worst-run, most financially upside-down state in the Union. After enacting their graduated income tax in 1996 on a promise of relief for middle-income families, a la the promise being offered in Illinois at present, what actually happened is income taxes on middle-income families increased by 13% over the last 2 decades, and while the promise was also property tax relief would come, in fact, property taxes on those same families have increased 35% during the same period, the rapaciousness of government. Therefore, if you believe in the Willie Sutton formulation of politics, and in Illinois you should, that Pauls will go where the money is, then you know where they will go. 59% of Illinois taxpayers make between $10,000 and $100,000. Another 11% between $100,000 and $250,000. The supermajority of Illinois families are under $250,000. That's where the money is. Illinois is making between $25,000 and $100,000, represent about $150 billion in AGI, adjusted gross income. Those making between $100,000 and $200,000, that's another $112 billion in AGI. By comparison, those who make more than $1 million represent $58 billion in AGI, and in fact, the combined AGI of all filers who make more than $200,000 is $155 billion. So, to recap those numbers, $200,000 and below is $262 billion in adjusted gross income, and above $200,000 is $155 billion. 70% more adjusted gross income for filers making less than $200,000. That's where the money is, and that's where the politicians will go. If you want to believe these Ike Turner impersonators that, hey, baby, this time it's going to be different, you go ahead and believe them. You do so both at your own peril and by willfully ignoring the last 50 years of history of Illinois governance. I feel like I'm selling past the close to argue that the Illinois political ruling class cannot be trusted, but let me offer as profound an example as I have. Politicians in both parties in this state routinely argue their mission is to provide for the truly vulnerable. That's why they got into public service. That's why they're running for office. Those who need state services through no fault of their own will be provided said services if you elect them and if you give them more of your money after you elect them. In fact, Illinois continues to be among the worst in the nation in providing services to the developmentally disabled, truly vulnerable, in need of state services through no fault of their own. All the politicians campaign on them, literally on them, and fail to serve them. Why? Because it's not about them. And something that Ralph left out in his discussion of services, it's about the personnel. It's about the political payoffs to the political infrastructure that keeps these same people in power telling the same lies. That's what's actually happening. And this failure with respect to truly vulnerable people, people with developmental disabilities that we all say, I want to make sure those people are served. This is an indication of how barbaric this state has become. Forget dollars and cents. This is barbarism. To use other people, vulnerable people, as the means to your political power ends to line your own pockets and to line the pockets of public sector union bosses and to provide guaranteed seven-figure pensions that we know we can't afford and never could. It is not a tax policy problem. It is a promise problem, over-promising benefit levels that we cannot sustain. Benefit levels that have increased by 1,000%, 8.8% annually over the last 20 years. That's what's actually happening. That's why we have the largest unfunded pension liabilities in the country. As with the $60,000 a year consultant I opened my remarks with, and the tax rates contained in the proposal at bar, Mr. Martire and his ilk like to eliminate context from policy. We're not supposed to connect dots. Thus, Mr. Martire argues the state income tax has very little to do with business decisions or entrepreneurial activity. But that's, again, disingenuous. What about the layers and layers of costs on business? Many unpredictable. Businesses in Illinois face from workers' comp costs to the jackpot civil justice system in places like Cook County and the Metro East to those unbounded, unfunded liabilities I mentioned. According to Truth in Accounting, Illinois is a state with $250 billion in debt and $30 billion in assets. And we're to believe, as you just heard Mr. Martire say, that what we fundamentally have in Illinois is a revenue problem. What Illinois really has is a problem with politicians who are far too generous with other people's money and property. In sum, the graduated state income tax proposal on the November 2020 ballot is a fraud, plain and simple. It provides neither the tax relief promised nor the path to stable state services or balanced budgets, which we haven't had in 2 decades, by the way. It will compound the fiscal problems of Illinois faster than a pension COLA. In fact, the so-called fair tax is the height of unfairness for working people in Illinois. Thank you.
Time for rebuttal. 5 minutes. Then you, 5 minutes. Then you guys.
5 minutes, so many inaccuracies to counter. So let's just start with migration. Illinois has had net out-migration every single year for the last 95 years except one. Apparently, Illinois is a good state to leave. It's just that the data say. But interestingly enough, while a larger number of people from Illinois move into, let's say, neighboring Indiana or Wisconsin every single year than the number of people from those states that move into Illinois, a greater percentage of the populations of Wisconsin and Indiana move into Illinois than the percentage of our population that moves into their states. Yeah, we have negative out-migration here because we're just a big state with a lot more people. But a greater percentage of their population are moving here, and you know where they're moving? Cook and the Collier counties. Where do you think taxes are highest in Illinois? Cook and the collar counties. In fact, Dan, I don't know if you intended to, but helped to make my argument that there's really no statistically meaningful correlation between tax policy and migration. Other things matter more. That's why you have people from Illinois moving into the higher tax states of Iowa and Wisconsin, et cetera, and people from those states moving into the highest tax areas of either state. The peer-reviewed studies, ones where people have exposed their methodology to other independent folks, academics to look at, show that there's never been any statistically meaningful correlation between tax policy and migration. The things that matter, where your family is, where your job is, housing prices, and you're not going to believe this last one because you all are still living in Illinois, but weather. Apparently some people like nice weather, so they move to nice weather states. Tax policy hasn't been a driver. And as far as ties between tax policy and the economy, it's not just my organization that's saying that those things don't exist. Once again, you should go to our website. We have a study called Good for Business that just did a meta-analysis of all the research that's out there on the subject. And even very conservative anti-tax organizations like the Kauffman Foundation for Entrepreneurship and the Cato Institute, when they did studies that were exposed to peer review, found no statistically meaningful correlation between your tax policy and economic growth. Other things matter more. So if you want some numbers on that, 41 states in America actually have an income tax, meaning 9 do not. So let's compare economic growth over the last 10 years between those 9 states with no income tax at all. And these include the miracle economic states, by the way. You got your Texas, Florida in here, you got North Dakota, you got Nevada, all these states, people say these great places. To the economic growth in those 9 states in America that not only have an income tax, but have the highest income tax rates of any state. So that would be your Californias, your New Yorks, your Connecticut's, your Massachusetts, Minnesota's, et cetera. There's 9 of them. State GDP per capita, the high tax states have significantly and statistically meaningfully outperformed the no tax states. How about median wage? Median wage in the high tax states is $60,000 a year. Median wage in the no tax states is $57,000 a year. How about personal income? Higher in the high tax states. How about disposable personal income? Higher in the high tax states. Does that mean you tax yourself to prosperity? No. What it means is your tax policy isn't the driver of what's happening economically in your state. Texas does really well economically because they have a lot of dead dinosaurs under the ground. Oil. Texas doesn't have an income tax. Why? You and I pay Texas's state taxes. How do we do that? They charge a severance tax every time oil is extracted from the ground, and that gets tied into the price of something called gasoline, which we pay. You really need to look at these things for what they are and look at what the data really say. Yeah, the state did increase its taxes in 2011, Dan pointed that out. That's
2017.
Accurate. From 2011 to 2015, I haven't looked at the data after that, so you may have data after that. From 2011 to 2015, out-migration actually slowed down in Illinois. Not because we raised our taxes. It's because migration and tax policy are independent variables. The one does not create causation on the other. But if you really want some of the more stark examples of this, let's just talk about 2 states, Kansas and Minnesota. Okay? About 10, 11 years ago, Kansas got a new governor, Brownback, and he said, let's use Kansas as the test case. We are going to cut taxes on our job creators, rich people, and that will create such an economic stimulus through the trickle-down effect that we'll have so many new jobs, Kansas's economy will outgrow Midwestern neighbors, the rest of the nation, and the tax cut will pay for itself. Because even though we're cutting taxes at the top, all these folks getting trickled on will have so many new jobs and they'll pay so much more in taxes that net from a revenue standpoint, our state won't be harmed. So Kansas did. They cut taxes. And what happened? Their economy did not take off. In fact, it fell behind the Midwest and the nation. They had massive deficits. They cut spending on K-12 education so significantly the Kansas Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutionally denied Kansas students access to a quality education and literally forced the General Assembly to restore the cuts and hence raise taxes back. Then you have Minnesota. Governor Dayton came in, and he inherited a hot mess, right? He inherited an accumulated deficit at his state level of $6.1 billion, with a state that has a population about the size of Cook County. It's a huge deficit. His state economy had only created 4,000 jobs in the prior 7 years combined, not per year. They had bridges collapsing, and they had unemployment rate north of 7%, one of the 2 or 3 highest in the nation at the time. When he looked at their fiscal condition, he said, look, we need a capital program, we need to invest in our schools, we're underfunding education, we can't balance our budget, we have to raise taxes, but we want to raise them not on low and moderate income families, but on affluent families. So he bumped up the top income tax rate in Minnesota to 9.85%, which is the 3rd highest tax rate in America. 4 years later, the Minnesota economy had created 174,000 new jobs. Their unemployment rate was down to 3%. They had a budget surplus and 2 capital programs. This is more evidence that when you really look at all the data in context and combined, you see that there never has been any statistically meaningful correlation between your tax policy and your growth. The crucial thing with tax policy is to, I don't know, pick up a textbook that shows you how it's supposed to be designed in a modern economy and maybe follow what the textbooks say. And the textbooks all say you need to have your income tax have a graduated rate structure so it could respond to how incomes are actually being distributed in the economy over time, number one, and to treat taxpayers more fairly. And I'm just going to say one thing on tax burden. I don't want you to trust my numbers. Sure don't want you to trust his numbers. So go to the Federation of Tax Administrators. It's an independent research organization available on the web. They have no modeling. They have no complex methodology. All they do is they report what state governments report and local governments report as the total revenue they collect from all sources, any tax or any fee, charged to support any unit of local government. And they total that up. There's a dollar amount. That's your total cost of government. And then they say, and according to the BEA, Bureau of Economic Analysis, here's personal income in that state. They divide total revenue raised by total personal income, this would be simple math, to come out with tax burden as a percentage of income. And then they rank all the states. Illinois ranks 27th in total tax and local state burden as a percentage of income when you include all taxes and fees. No modeling, no creative thing, no ideology, just what the actual verifiable numbers are. I think that's a better starting point.
Thank you, Ralph. Dan, please take a few minutes.
Well, I mean, why don't we start with the Cato Institute, because it's fun when a tax eater quotes the Cato Institute as being indifferent to tax rates. This from Chris Taylor at the Cato Institute. In sum, trying to raise revenues by increasing the top income tax rates is a perverse budget strategy. It would hit some of the most talented people in the economy, since high earners generally have the largest behavioral responses to taxes. The deadweight losses, or costs of inefficiency, of such tax changes would be quite large. And since deadweight losses rise more than proportionally as more marginal tax rates rise, raising the top rates would be very counterproductive. Sort of a statement of philosophy on tax policy rooted in economic theory. So I guess some people are reading different textbooks than your Paul Krugman set. There are a lot of Nobel Prize winners who would argue against this premise that we're supposed to accept that a sensible tax policy obviously starts with a graduated state income tax. And I'll tell you what, all these miracles happening around the country in these blue states that people are fleeing, it's really something. I mean, if raising the rate in Minnesota to 9%, if that was great, then why don't we show Minnesota something and double ours and raise it to 18, double theirs and we'll raise it to 18% here? I mean, this idea that it seems to be, not only is tax policy indifferent to people's personal choices, it's beneficial. The more you increase taxes, the greater benefit you get, the greater growth that somehow occurs. This is asinine. This runs counter to Econ 101, unless you believe that if you tax something, you get more of it. I was taught, and this is actually by Keynesians like Bob Eisner at Northwestern, that if you tax something, you get less of it. So apparently, I, like the rest of this state, have slipped into this vortex where those laws don't apply anymore. Not to mention, according to the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute, who did polling on this that I referenced, half the state wants to leave, and the number one reason they cite is taxes. Apparently, this state is full of liars. Liars, liars, liars. No, you don't. I want to leave because my property taxes are too high, because the combined tax burden. No, you don't. You're lying. So next time you run into somebody that says, I'm leaving the state because of taxes, tell them they are a liar and Ralph Martire says so. In addition to that, out-migration? What? West Virginia and Illinois are the only states in the nation who've seen net out-migration 5 years running. It's not happening everywhere, and it's not happening in every major city. New York City has seen a population increase marginally. LA the same. Chicago not. Chicago is hemorrhaging population like the rest of the state. Chicago's at 1920 levels, population-wise. So there's something unique that's going on here, and I'm not the one saying that it's narrow income taxes only. It's not income taxes only. It's the whole kleptocracy. It's the layers and layers of fleecing and scams. It's the fact that you don't own your home, that you rent it from the government. What your home actually is collateral for somebody else's public sector pension, and it will be liquidated if it hasn't already been. Out-migration's not happening. It's happening everywhere. It's no big deal. What? I mean, seriously, the level of suspension of disbelief by people advancing these policies is remarkable. It is very much like talking to any member of the General Assembly, including a lot of Republicans. Things aren't as bad as you think. There's plenty of blame to go around, and we're working on it. Great. K-12 education, just a couple of other things, and then I'll stop. The spending. K-12 spending in this state, adjusted for inflation, has increased at 12x enrollment increases over the last 20 years. And it's the same deal he does with taxes. Let's look at K-12 spending in isolation. Now, he broke it out. I'll give him that. But when you combine property taxes plus the state support, Illinois is in the top 10 in terms of the resources it provides K-12 education. And in point of fact, in higher education, Illinois provides twice the national average in per pupil subsidy to our public colleges and universities. And frankly, we shouldn't. We're subsidizing tuition, not access. Yeah, so there's a lot of policies that are wrong, but they're wrong for all the opposite reasons that Ralph suggests they are. Because they all run counter to these fundamental principles of economics and the fact that people do respond to the incentives with which they're presented. And lastly, I'm not going to be ideological about this. Ralph's the ideologue. He's the central planner that wants to design some perfect, fair tax system with a bunch of mystics at his union-funded Center for Tax and Budget Accountability shop. Okay, fine. Here's what I said, the question that still hasn't been answered, and you should think about this. The proponents of this proposal say it will raise $3.5 billion. $3.5 billion. And again, twice that in unpaid bills right now. Governor Pritzker has proposed $10 billion in spending. We got $200 billion in unfunded public pension and health care benefits. $3.5 billion. So what's the end game here? You think this is the end point? This is the starting point. How can anybody not see that? Where else do you come up with the money? Where's it going to come from?
Okay. There you go.
Okay. All right. So I have to have 2 quick data points that he just misled folks on.
I'm hoping for good question. Look at Brian Daly. He's got a microphone in his hand. Ralph's making two quick points.
K-12
Dan might have 1 point after that, but we're getting to you guys.
Illinois is the only state in America that artificially inflates what it spends on K-12 funding by reporting its debt service payments to the pension system as if it's a current expenditure on education. No other state in America reports that. So when you take that out and you just compare current expenditures on education versus current expenditures on education, we drop way down.
You're borrowing.
No, they're paying back.
There's $120 billion. There's $120 billion in K through 12.
Did I ever cut him off? Dan,
please
behave. They borrowed in the past,
Don't worry, I'm
paying
leaving
it
too.
back now because they had that structural imbalance in their revenue system. So they borrowed from what they owed the pensions, and then in 1995 they passed a repayment law that is so backloaded and artificially high and ramped up that it's what's straining our fiscal resources today on debt service.
And your
That's
other
number one.
the
The
other
other quick one is on higher ed. We have cut higher ed funding so significantly since the year 2002, when higher ed funding in Illinois was $2.1 billion. It is now 1.9, so $200 million less than it was 20 years ago. That we went from covering 70% of the cost of a student attending an institution of higher learning with state transfers, and at that time about 26% was covered by tuition and fees, to a flip. So now tuition and fees are covering 70% north, and state spending is covering in the 20s. You wonder why college is prohibitively too expensive for low and moderate income families, especially at public universities and community colleges. It's because of the radical state disinvestment that has driven up our tuition costs at more than 50% greater than the national rate over the same period.
All right, those were not as quick as I thought they were. You got a quick one.
This is all fun with numbers, but I'll at least provide citations. This is from the State of Illinois Governor's 2017 budget summary. Here's what's happened. Percentage change in state spending 2000 to 2015. Higher education, minus 8%. Human services, up 10%. Public safety, up 12%. K through 12, up 35%. Total state revenue, up 57%. State employees' insurance payments, up 188%. State employee pension benefits, up 584%. That's where the money is going,
Not
folks.
benefits, debt service.
All right.
Our first question.
Oh, you're interrupting me. Behave.
Because you must behave too.
Our first question.
Here we go.
All righty.
Please
My
introduce
name is
yourself.
Ann Summercamp. I'm from DuPage County, and I wanted to talk about Mr. Proft. You're mixing property taxes with income tax. The fair tax is only about income tax. So you're scaring these people because your property taxes are going to do what they're going to do. But this is a graduated income tax with specific brackets. You don't pay more money until after you've made, say, $250,000. You're paying the lower rate until you make that first dollar after.
And so the question is, and so the question is,
whatever. Here's my question. It is that we should. What do you think about reamortizing the pension debt?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Sure. I know. Keep borrowing against tomorrow to pay for yesterday, right? That's how we got it. Yeah. I know. That's Martire's
a minute. Come on. Here we go.
I'm not conflating anything. I'm describing holistically what the picture is. Do you pay your property taxes and your income taxes, or do you just pay one and not the other? See what matters for people, how people live their lives. What matters for how people live their lives, I understand what the ballot initiative, I described it. What matters for how people live their lives is the total state and local tax burden they pay, the total monthly nut they have to meet. That's what matters. And so, yes, I mentioned we have the highest property tax in the nation, which Illinois is the place where home has no equity. Right. I mentioned that. And what I'm saying, in addition to that, now you're laying on more taxes and to an already overtaxed state, highest local and state tax burden in the country, and for what? What is the return? And take a look 5 feet in front of you, not here, but here, take a look 5 feet in front of you and tell me, as I said, now for the third time, where does the rest of the money come from? If this graduated income tax proposal only produces $3.5 billion, and that's a very rosy scenario, that's static economic analysis, which the state loves to do, then where does the money come from for all of the other obligations that have already been incurred, much less anything you want to do on a go-forward basis, like Governor Pritzker's $10 billion in new spending? Where does it come from?
Okay. Ralph?
Right, so like I said, go to the Federation of Tax Administrators so that you could all see no one's worldview, the actual numbers. Total state and local tax burden as a percentage of income in Illinois, we rank in the bottom half, 27th, including the property tax and every fee and every gas tax and excise tax and blah, blah, blah. We're 27th. So, and that's just based on the actual numbers, no one modeling it, no one whatever. So please go there. Number two, everyone, even the supporters of the fair tax, say it doesn't solve all the problems. There are other things the state needs to do. It does need to re-amortize the pension debt to get it to a level payment amount, which is the best practice. Still grow the funded ratio every single year, bring the systems to health, but save taxpayers roughly $45 billion between now and 2045 that either would have to be raised in taxes or cut in spending on services, and still move the systems from where they are now, which is actually only 38% funded, up to 72% funded, and you're healthy at 80. And then the very next year, your total payment into the pension system would drop significantly and taxpayers would save even more money. But it's not a kick the can down the road philosophy. Actually, it raises the funded ratio faster because more money would go in up front, and keeps the funded ratio at a higher level until literally the final 3 years. And the ramp is so backloaded that in the final 3 years, that ramp jumps from below 70% funded to over 90.
Can I just say one thing? Can I just say one thing about this? Does anybody care about how we got here? We have the worst credit rating in the country in Illinois. We have the worst credit rating of any state in the nation since Dukakis, Massachusetts, almost 30 years ago. That's how bad it is. Why? Because of the profligate borrowing against tomorrow to pay for yesterday that we're still advocating. So the problem with what we've done so far, not big enough.
Okay.
Next question over here. You get state your name. I'm Dr. Yerix, Illinois Congressional District 3. It takes a constitutional amendment to change our current tax structure that protects our taxpayers who earn an income and put away our money for our retirement and our families. Being a hard-working, middle-class taxpayer who's already hit with a 32% increase in our taxes, why are you going after our middle class, our retirement savings, and our hard-earned money we want to leave our children?
Okay,
Ralph, that's directed to you.
Yeah.
So,
Why are you doing that?
well, first of all, none of that's happening. So number one, middle class people receive a very modest tax relief under this proposal. They do not receive a tax increase. It's only the wealthiest 3% in the state that get their taxes increased. That's number one. Number two, no one's taxing retirement income. Illinois is one of 3 states out of the 41 with an income tax that never taxes any retirement income. It's us, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania. That doesn't change under this. So your retirement income is still going to be tax-free in this state, like it always has been. So it is not a tax increase on the middle class. And in fact, it's not even an onerous tax increase on the wealthiest 3%. So right now, if you look at tax burden as a percentage of income in Illinois, everyone on the bottom 20, 40, 60, 80% pays more than 12% of their income in state and local taxes, whereas the wealthiest 1% in our state pay only 7.4%. After this law passes, if it passes, the wealthiest go up from paying 7.4% of their income to 10%. Still the lowest tax burden in the state as a percentage of income. It's just because so much income growth is concentrated at the top that that's where you have to go with your income tax to respond to the economy. And it's just not incomes that are concentrated at the top. Once again, numbers you could run yourself at home. Look at census data. According to the U.S. Census, today in America, the wealthiest 10% hold 77% of America's wealth. The wealthiest 3% hold over half of it. This is because of income inequality that is going on for a long time, with growth in income going to the top. So if the one tax that you could have that could be designed to respond to this doesn't respond to it, you will have fiscal problems because you're not going to raise adequate revenue in your fiscal system, and you're going to overtax low and moderate income families and undertax affluent families. That's the very clear and evidence-proven outcome of our current flat tax.
I just wanted to make sure everybody takes judicial note that retirement income has been called. Where do you think they're going to go after this income tax, this graduated income tax is imposed, in addition to scaling the rates? Where the money is.
Next question.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Arthur. So Site Selection Magazine has rated for the last 6 years running Chicago and the collar counties #1 location for corporate investment. A couple corporate headquarters have moved to Chicago, most recently Molson Coors, relocating from Denver to Chicago, and they specifically cited need to talent. They can't find the people they're looking for in Denver, but they can find them in Chicago. It seems incongruous that you say we're losing all our talent because of taxation, yet corporations are relocating headquarters and major office complexes and facilities to Chicago looking for talent. Can you resolve that incongruity?
Yeah, I mean, Chicago's still a great city with a lot of talented people, and it's a very livable city compared to like in New York or even in LA. And it's a diversified economy, particularly, and one of the reasons we haven't gone the way of Detroit as fast as Detroit went the way of Detroit is because of that diversification, because of the exchanges and all the banking and insurance surrounding the exchanges, because of the legacy manufacturing here that's not easy to pick up and move, although a lot of it has picked up and moved. So yes, here's something. You know, San Francisco is sort of a mecca for high-tech talented people too. Very small cadre of them. And so if the idea is to make Chicago and frankly the entire state of Illinois San Francisco, then we're on the right path here. What's happening is a hollowing out, and it doesn't happen overnight. You remember the line from The Big Short? When's it going to happen? It's happening. So it's happening over time. It's not the bottom falling out all at once. But I would look at other leading indicators about the vitality of this city across the socioeconomic spectrum. As you saw, CPS, after their little strike, announced another 6% decline in student population. As people continue to flee CPS, flee the south and west sides of the city, those are demilitarized zones now. You also may have noted Realtor.com this year ranked Chicago 200th of the top 200 urban markets for real estate prices. So once you start to make this city increasingly unaffordable, and as I mentioned in my argument, the stratification continues to occur between people at the top, the Champagne Socialists on the lakefront by where I live, who are insulated from terrible public policy, and the beneficiaries of transfer payments who are insulated from terrible public policy, and not much in between, because frankly it's 35 to 54-year-olds who are leading the exodus from Chicago and Illinois. It's not retirees going to Dal Webb's place in Tempe. That's not what's happening. So yes, we still have a lot of corporate offices here. We still got a lot of super talented, successful people here. We should guard those things jealously rather than take them for granted. What we're doing is taking them for granted, and they're not going to be here to be punished. Because let me tell you something about all of Ralph's back-of-the-envelope math. Those people who have a concentration of wealth, they also have a concentration of options. And they don't have to be a Chicago resident, they don't have to be an Illinois resident, and they will continue to not be.
Okay, no, a quick response. So to your point, yeah, places like New York and LA, which have much higher taxes than we do here in the States, see growth as well. We are seeing growth there. And places like Austin, Texas, which have lower taxes, see significant growth, which shows you when you look at all the data, there's no statistically meaningful correlation between your tax policy and where these businesses locate. They locate based on proximity to suppliers, customers, talent base, financial markets, transportation hubs. That's what drives economic development. And it's never been about tax policy. And as far as migration for millionaires, and so once again, not only has there never been any study that found that, Stanford University did a great study of the special millionaires tax they passed in New Jersey a couple of years ago, maybe 7, 8 years ago now. And New Jersey is an interesting case because it's right next to New York City, Philadelphia, Connecticut. So people in New Jersey that are millionaires can move to any of these areas and have the exact same lifestyle, the exact same network, the exact same everything, their business intact. And what they found 6 years after the special millionaires tax was passed is out-migration of millionaires did increase by 0.4% over this sequence. But that said, net millionaire growth in New Jersey was significantly higher at the end of that period than it was at the beginning of it. It's just trying to find causation between tax policy and these bigger decisions that are economic-based is just flawed. There's never been a peer-reviewed study that finds the causation. So, Dan, when it gets to tax policy, what I say is don't have the highest rate in the state, and by the way, we wouldn't under this proposal in the nation. Have tax policy designed to fit your economy, fit your demographics, so that you raise adequate revenue on a sustainable basis to fund public services to the level necessary to meet demographically driven needs, and you're done. And that's a different calculus for every state. They have different economies, different needs, and different populations, but the textbooks guide us on how to do it, and a graduated rate income tax is a crucial part.
I love these textbooks. A case study of the millionaire tax, contrary to what Ralph said, Maryland. The Wall Street Journal wrote about it, and they rescinded their millionaire surcharge after they did it. But I agree with you. Here's a point we have agreement, so I just want to emphasize this. It is not solely the state's income tax rate, or even were the rates to be graduated. I haven't said that. I said in context of every other decision that's been made, every other metric that influences cost of doing business, that is competitive in the 50 laboratories of democracy. Illinois is on the wrong end of those metrics. That's the fundamental problem. So this just exacerbates, this proposal would just exacerbate the death spiral we're already in for all kinds of other and additional reasons.
I'm hoping my death spiral, comes a few days from now at least. To bring us together at the near close of our program, we turn to Vince Colber.
With the final question.
How'd you know?
Thank you. So, Mr. Martire, first of all, and someone who digests a lot of economic textbooks, including Adam Smith, right? Wouldn't Adam Smith agree that if you raise the taxes on entrepreneurs and investors, that their cost of capital would go up? He would. He'd say, yes, their cost of capital would go up. So, if there is an investor entrepreneur who's going to have a business and has a location choice and can go to a zero tax rate state or Illinois, and the projection is $1 million of profit is going to be achieved in a reasonable period of time, that business is going to pay, and that owner of that business is going to pay $80,000 more. All other things being equal, with this Adam Smith, who you quote at the outset as being authority on these issues, would that Adam Smith, that same Adam Smith, advise this investment situation to stay in, to go to Illinois? Or would Adam Smith say, no, it might be smarter for you to go where you're going to pay $80,000 less and retain your profit for reinvestment? That's my question.
Okay, so
30 seconds and 30 seconds.
The problem with your hypothetical is all other things aren't equal. And that's really the key part of this analysis. Tax policy doesn't drive these decisions. These decisions are driven by those other factors. The chairman of State Farm, when he was talking publicly, State Farm Insurance, about how they make site selection, says taxes don't enter into the equation. They look at everything else. And that's how they make a decision, everything else being proximity to customer, suppliers, et cetera. So, you can create a false hypothetical that forces a decision down a certain path, but ignores the reality of tax policy and the role it plays in the economy.
Dan?
I'll just conclude by saying, look, if we continue down this path of confiscatory taxation and debt loading and big government gambits, then Adam Smith's butcher, baker, and candlestick maker aren't going to be Illinois residents.
Folks, for us to understand... Thank you. For us to understand the issues, we've got to be able to talk about them, and today we were graced by two guys who really know what they're talking about and have brought a lot to the conversation. You can listen to Dan on his radio show every morning on AM 560, and Ralph was telling me before he's got a great website, which is the...
ctbaonline.org.
Okay, it doesn't have a great address, but it is a great website, and you can find it because I'm sure it's in the material. We used to get these from China, but then we switched to Ukraine, and I want to say, there's no quid pro quo. Thank you. Thank you. After the election, I can be more flexible.
Thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. And while you're at it, please leave us a comment. Thank you for watching.